Good morning, this is Mission Control Houston, live in the International Space Station's Flight Control Room. You're looking at a live view of Northrop Grumman's Cygnus cargo spacecraft in the grasp of the space station's robotic arm as it prepares to depart the International Space Station. The International Space Station sees 16 sunsets and sunrises per day, so the lighting can fluctuate as the day goes on. The plan is to release Cygnus during certain windows of opportunity where ground controllers operating the robotic arm and the astronauts monitoring the space station have good visibility of the spacecraft. The first window opened at 5:03 a.m. Central, about 10 minutes after an orbital sunrise. The original plan was to release Cygnus in that window at 5:05 a.m. Central. However, flight controllers are in no hurry, and many windows were worked into this timeline today. It was decided to choose a window 1 hour later to better set up Cygnus's trajectory to be clear of conjunctions, as well as improved communications capability after release from the spacecraft. And the scheduled release time is now 6:05 a.m. Central. The Cygnus spacecraft is about 19 meters away from the International Space Station. Remember that it is not berthed, but rather at the end of the robotic arm. Coming up next, we have a go, no-go poll here in Mission Control, where Flight Director Brandon Lloyd will consult with his flight directors and the team over at Northrop Grumman to see if we're good for release. The operation that you're watching today is completely done here on the ground. The astronauts are not controlling the robotic arm that you see here on screen. However, NASA astronauts Jessica Watkins and Bob Hines are monitoring Cygnus's departure and are ready to take control in the unlikely event of an emergency. You may hear our Capcom Jackie Mahaffey communicating with the astronauts throughout our coverage today. Right before our coverage began, she talked to the crew just to go over roles and responsibilities. This includes monitoring the spacecraft, making sure that they have good visibility to help support the crew on the ground. The spacecraft arrived in February of 2022 and berthed to the Earth-facing port of the station's Unity module. It delivered food, scientific experiments, and other supplies to the astronauts on board. The space station crew has unloaded this cargo and worked this week to fill Cygnus with trash and other disposable items, and do other closeout tasks like disconnect the power and ventilation systems and close the hatch door. The station's robotic arm is set to release Cygnus from the space station at 6:05 a.m. Central today, after which the spacecraft will make a fiery re-entry into Earth's atmosphere over the Pacific Ocean on Wednesday, June 29th, effectively getting rid of the waste as it harmlessly burns up in the atmosphere.
Houston Station on 2, Cygnus departure review complete. Houston copies. Stand by for step 2. Standing by.
Northrop Grumman and NASA are in what we call joint operations. They're in constant communication during this departure, and Cygnus will fly free at the hands of robotics officers here in Houston sending commands to the station's Canadarm2 robotic arm. Cygnus is at the end of the robotic arm, firmly in the grasp of the LEE, or latching end effector. This is basically the hand at the end of the arm that uses latches and snares to firmly grasp onto the spacecraft. We're getting a live view now of the Northrop Grumman Flight Control Room in Dulles, Virginia. This team that you see here will take full control of the Cygnus spacecraft after it has left the approach ellipsoid. We're in a brief but expected handover period here in Mission Control as we toss communications over to our next satellites, and we should expect full coverage and views of the Cygnus spacecraft back momentarily. The teams that you see here in Mission Control are getting ready to conduct the go, no-go poll for the release of the Cygnus cargo spacecraft.
Station Houston on 2 for Cygnus. Go for Cygnus configuration checks. Perform step 2 in 1.602, Cygnus release and departure monitoring. Copy, go for step 2 in 1.602.
The go, no-go poll is now underway. Flight Director Brandon Lloyd in the center of your screen is conducting the poll now.
Houston Station on 2, Cygnus configuration checks are complete. The crew is ready for release and departure.
Station Houston, at this time, the no exercise constraint is in effect. You are go for Cygnus departure on time. Perform steps 3 and 4 in 1.602.
Station copies, no exercise constraint in effect, and go for steps 3 and 4 on time.
And you just heard Capcom Jackie Mahaffey communicate with the crew that we have pulled go here in Mission Control, and we are ready for an on-time departure of the Cygnus cargo spacecraft at 6:05 a.m. Central. Before our coverage began today, robotics operators here in Mission Control received the go to demate Cygnus and use the robotic arm to uninstall the spacecraft from its port and guide it away from the space station and into its release position where you see it now. The flight director just conducted a go-no-go poll for the spacecraft's release. The flight director today is Brandon Lloyd, and he will be overseeing the flight controllers in Mission Control during today's operation. Another key player here in the room is Visiting Vehicle Officer Thomas Castleberry. Cygnus, of course, is a vehicle that visited the space station and is getting ready to depart, and the Visiting Vehicle Officer communicates directly to Northrop Grumman flight controllers in Dulles, Virginia to receive vehicle status and updates. After release at 6:05 a.m. Central, Cygnus will initiate a departure burn scheduled to last for 3 minutes to help the spacecraft back away from the space station. It'll first exit the keep-out sphere and then the approach ellipsoid. These are invisible markers or safety zones around the International Space Station, and when crossed, this lets flight controllers know that in the unlikely event of an emergency, the Cygnus spacecraft will not cross these lines again at their respective points. When the spacecraft has exited the approach ellipsoid, joint operations will end, and so will our live coverage today. Northrop Grumman's team will take full control of the spacecraft and command the spacecraft to deploy secondary payloads, such as some small satellites, before the spacecraft burns up in the atmosphere. But while delivering the scientific experiments and other supplies to the astronauts was the main mission for Cygnus, this particular spacecraft also had the goal of testing its ability to reboost the International Space Station. On Saturday, June 25th, Cygnus completed its first limited reboost of the station after the engine fired for a full duration of 5 minutes 1 second to adjust the space station's orbit. It raised the station's altitude by 1/10 of a mile at apogee, or the highest point, and 1/2 a mile at perigee. This successful test maneuver was designed to prove an enhanced capability to be used in the future for the orbiting laboratory. While this was the first full reboost by a USOS visiting vehicle, another demonstration of this maneuver was performed back in 2018 during Northrop Grumman's 9th commercial resupply mission to the International Space Station. And we are now 4 minutes away from the scheduled release of the Cygnus cargo spacecraft. This Cygnus cargo spacecraft is a freighter belonging to Northrop Grumman, and the company has a history of naming each Cygnus after a person who's played a major role in the field of human spaceflight. This particular Cygnus was given the name the SS Pierce Sellers. Sellers was a NASA astronaut who played a critical role in the assembly of the International Space Station and went on to make great contributions in the field of climate science. He passed away in 2016, and this Cygnus serves as a reminder of his contributions. We're now less than 2 minutes away from the release of the Cygnus cargo spacecraft. We're going to see it move away from the International Space Station and then begin a departure burn. We should expect some conversation with the Capcom to the crew when this happens.
Station Houston for Cygnus, ISS thrusters are inhibited and ground M1 is go for release on time.
Copy, thrusters inhibited and go on time for release.
Capcom Jackie Mahaffey just communicated to the crew that we are ready for an on-time departure of the Cygnus cargo spacecraft. While it looks a little dark on our screens, the crew has confirmed that they have visibility of the cargo spacecraft, and as does the robotics controller here on the ground.
Proceeding with release.
Station copies.
Release commanded.
Station copies.
The latching end effector, or the hand of the Canadarm2 robotic arm, is in the process of unlatching or letting go of the Cygnus cargo spacecraft.
Snares open. Begin monitoring for drift out.
Station copies.
And the release of the Cygnus spacecraft supporting Northrop Grumman's 17th commercial resupply mission to the International Space Station is confirmed at 6:07 a.m. Central Time, while the space station was flying over the Pacific Ocean.
The pin has exited the Lee.
Houston copies. Proceeding to back away.
Station copies.
The Cygnus cargo spacecraft is now working on backing away from the space station's robotic arm. Coming up next is the initiation of a departure burn to move the spacecraft away from the International Space Station. This burn is scheduled to fire for about 3 minutes and carry Cygnus through the approach ellipsoid. At this point, joint operations will end and Northrop Grumman will be in full control of the spacecraft.
Back away in progress.
Station copies.
And back away has begun. You can see some lights on the top of your screen. I know it's a dark view, but that is the Cygnus cargo spacecraft slowly drifting away from the space station's robotic arm.
Houston Station sees us at 4.5 meters clear, 1.5 meters clear.
Houston copies 1.5.
Houston, we see us 4.5 meters clear, proceeding with vehicle departure.
Houston concurs.
The view that you're looking at now is a camera at the end of the space station's Canadarm2 robotic arm, looking at the Cygnus cargo spacecraft as it backs away.
Houston, Cygnus depart commanded.
And back away complete.
Copy, back away complete.
Station Houston, Cygnus departure burn is in progress. Monitor departure burn, step 5 in 1.602.
Station copies, departure burn in progress, monitoring per step 5.
The purpose of the departure burn, of course, is to move Cygnus away from the International Space Station, but it's also to move the vehicle through the keep-out sphere and the proto-ellipsoid. The keep-out sphere is an imaginary sphere 200 meters in radius around the space station. It's one of the safety zones we talked about earlier that applies to visiting vehicles either arriving or, in this case, departing the space station. Before moving into the keep-out sphere, the spacecraft must be configured where it would not cross this imaginary boundary again for at least 4 orbits, even if the spacecraft lost all maneuvering in the unlikely event of an emergency. The Cygnus cargo spacecraft is now reaching about 100 meters away from the International Space Station.
Station Houston, for exercise constraints, we are no longer in the no exercise constraint, and the T2 constraint will lift in approximately 20 minutes.
Station copies, you're outside of the no exercise constraint band, and the no T2 exercise constraint band lifts in about 20 minutes.
Station Houston for Cygnus. Cygnus departure burn complete. Perform step 6 in 1.602. And for your information, Cygnus has exited the 200-meter keep-out sphere.
Okay, we copy that Cygnus has exited the keep-out sphere and Wilco in step 6.
Jackie Mahaffey, our Capcom today, just communicated with astronauts Bob Hines and Jessica Watkins monitoring today's operation that Cygnus has completed its departure burn and it was nominal, and it has effectively moved the spacecraft out of the keep-out sphere. Cygnus is now over 300 meters away from the space station, and if you remember, the keep-out sphere is an imaginary sphere 200 meters in radius around the space station. So Cygnus has made its way outside of the keep-out sphere, meaning that for this imaginary boundary, for at least 4 orbits, the spacecraft will not, even if it lost all maneuvering, it would not cross this imaginary boundary. The next milestone that we're approaching is the approach ellipsoid, this time pizza box in shape. It's a 3-dimensional shape, 4 kilometers by 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers. It's another one of the safety zones we have in place. One of the key differences is that the approach ellipsoid, if vehicles outside of it have to be on what we call a 24-hour safe free drift trajectory. So we know that the spacecraft would not cross into the approach ellipsoid for at least 24 hours, again, in the unlikely event of an emergency. And that's the next milestone that we see today.
Houston Station is complete through step 6.
Houston copies complete with step 6. That closes out your 1.602. And the next call you can expect from us is when Cygnus has exited the approach ellipsoid.
Okay, copy that. We'll stand by for approach ellipsoid exit.
The SS Pier Sellers Cygnus cargo spacecraft launched to the International Space Station on February 19th, lifting off from the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport on the eastern shore of Virginia, atop a Northrop Grumman and Antares rocket. It arrived at the orbiting lab with 8,300 pounds of supplies on February 21st. The International Space Station is a microgravity laboratory, and Cygnus delivered several scientific experiments. One research investigation Cygnus delivered is the X-Roots experiment. Here on Earth, we can use soil to grow plants, but it can get heavy and need regular maintenance. And if brought to space, soil would be hard to contain. We wouldn't want any small flakes flying away. X-Roots uses hydroponic, or water-based, and aeroponic, or air-based methods of growing crops in space. Learning efficient ways of growing food is important for long-duration missions to the moon, but can also benefit growing methods here on Earth. Another experiment that this spacecraft delivered is microQuinn3D tumor. It looked at the effects of a treatment on breast and prostate cancer cells. In microgravity, these cells grow in a 3-dimensional model, which makes it easier for researchers to look at things like its structure, gene expression, and the cell's overall response to treatment drugs. If you're just joining us today, today's coverage is all about the release of the Cygnus cargo spacecraft supporting Northrop Grumman's 17th commercial resupply mission. It has nearly completed its mission, being released from the International Space Station's robotic arm at 6:07 a.m. Central Time, while Cygnus and the space station were flying over the Pacific Ocean. It successfully completed a departure burn to move it away from the space station and out of the keep-out sphere, and is now making its way out to the approach ellipsoid to pass through that safety barrier. Mission Control Houston is working really closely with Mission Control in Dulles, Virginia, the site of Northrop Grumman's Mission Control. We're in something known as joint operations right now, where both control rooms are working together to control the Cygnus cargo spacecraft. But after the spacecraft moves out of the approach ellipsoid, it will be in full control of Northrop Grumman. They'll work on some checkouts of the spacecraft and deploy some secondary payloads like small satellites before it burns up in the atmosphere. The SS Pierre Sellers Cygnus is approaching 900 meters away from the International Space Station. We're in a momentary loss of signal. It was a planned but expected loss of communications, but we expect to get our video feedback very soon. In the meantime, you're looking at a live view of the International Space Station's flight control room here in Mission Control Houston. Key players in this room today are Flight Director Brandon Lloyd. He is the lead flight director for Cygnus operations today. To his right is Capcom Jackie Mahaffey. You've heard her voice communicating to the crew. Astronauts Bob Hines and Jessica Watkins is who she was talking to today. They were monitoring the departure of the Cygnus cargo spacecraft. Our visiting vehicle officer is Thomas Castleberry, and of course this operation was completed by robotics officers here on the ground. With that view, we have the back of the Canadarm2 robotic arm, where about 20 minutes ago the Cygnus cargo spacecraft was attached and is now flying free on its way to the approach ellipsoid. The Cygnus cargo spacecraft is about 1,200 meters away from the International Space Station and is moving towards the approach ellipsoid. We expect a call out to the crew after it has passed this point.
Station Houston on 2 for Cygnus. Cygnus has exited the approach ellipsoid.
Copy. Cygnus has exited the approach ellipsoid. We just want to take a second and say congratulations to the entire Northrop Grumman and NASA team on an outstanding NG-17 mission. In addition to the literal tons of supplies, science, and hardware it delivered to the ISS, the NG-17 Cygnus SS Piers Sellers successfully completed a reboost of the ISS, bringing a new and important capability to the space station that Sellers helped build. The success of this mission is a testament to the dedication and persistence of the team over the course of the mission and the years leading up to it. Congratulations again to all who made it possible.
Houston and MCC Dulles, copy.
The Cygnus cargo spacecraft is now outside of the approach ellipsoid. We just heard NASA astronaut Jessica Watkins recap the mission and give kind words to the SS Piers Sellers, one of the NASA astronauts who came before her, who played an instrumental role in the building of the International Space Station. She also gave nod to the fact that the Cygnus cargo spacecraft performed a reboost of the International Space Station, proving that capability. Here in Mission Control Houston, Flight Director Brandon Lloyd just congratulated the team of flight controllers, acknowledging some of the key players throughout the Cygnus spacecraft mission. Joint operations are coming to an end, so Mission Control is handing over controls to the Northrop Grumman team over in Dulles, Virginia. The Cygnus cargo spacecraft was successfully released from the space station's robotic arm at 6:07 a.m. Central Time, 7:07 a.m. Eastern, as the space station and the spacecraft flew over the Pacific Ocean. The maneuver was executed by robotics officers here in Mission Control, and it completed a nominal departure burn to back away from the space station. It first moved out of the keep-out sphere and now outside of the approach ellipsoid. That concludes our coverage, but the spacecraft will go on to release some secondary payloads before it makes a harmless, fiery re-entry back into Earth's atmosphere. To keep up with Cygnus and its mission, follow the ISS blog and follow us on social media for further updates. This is Mission Control Houston.